we're going to be diving deeper into World War II. Today, we're going to be studying the naval warfare in the Pacific. Due to the colonization of South Pacific, many nations controlled a lot of the islands, which allowed Japan to easily take over since there was not a unified force. The only places that remained under US control that stood in Japan's way was Midway and the Hawaiian Islands. The bombing of Pearl Harbor came by surprise to the United States, which led to a successful bombing of many of the ships and planes located on Pearl Harbor. However, since the aircraft carriers were doing exercises, none of them were sunken. Before we move on, let's talk about the leaders of each of the navies. Rear Admiral Chester A. Nimitz of the United States Navy was a master tactician. This allowed the United States Navy to come through with many victories against the experienced and strategic Japanese Navy. Admiral of the Japanese fleet was Isokuro Yamamoto. He was also a master tactician, and he allowed the Japanese to have many surprises on the US Navy. He was in charge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Before we talk about the war, let's talk about the ships and the aircraft, mostly focusing on the United States. In this photo, you can see many of the United States Navy ships. Some of the most important ships are the aircraft carrier, the battleship, the cruiser, and transport carriers. We will focus mostly on the aircraft carriers as they were an essential part of the United States Navy in World War II. Also known as the floating city, these ships could hold up to 3,000 troops, and it had anything from a barbershop to a kitchen to even a cobbler. One of the major reasons why aircraft carriers were essential during the Pacific War was their ability to hold and launch aircraft. In this picture, you can see how many are fitting just on half of the deck. This was important to launch attacks against Japanese islands. In this picture, you can see many of the aircraft that were used in the United States Navy. Let's talk about the Pacific War. Before we begin, there needs to be a couple of notes mentioned. First, the United States can easily outproduce Japan. Second, Japan has already been at war with China for several years. And third, the United States didn't enter the war in Europe until 1944. As mentioned before, Pearl Harbor was the start of the war against Japan. Many battles took place, but the most important is the Battle of Midway. It was the key factor for deciding the US victory against Japan. One reason for this is that the United States could easily outproduce Japan, and they could break the Japanese naval codes. And even though people assume that naval battles take place amongst battleships and cruisers, the real battles take place between aircraft carriers and the aircraft attacking them. That's why it was essential for so many ships to help escort the aircraft carriers to safety. Through strategic victories, the United States was able to slowly move its way towards Japan. And while the ships were fighting battles, troops were to land on the islands and take over the entrenched Japanese. This strategy was known as island hopping. As the war came to an end, the Japanese Navy was almost completely decimated. However, the Japanese troops entrenched on the islands were a tough fight, and many lives were lost trying to invade those islands. So the United States had two options: invade Japan or drop the atomic bombs. Discuss with a partner, should the United States have dropped the atomic bombs in Japan? Make sure to justify your reasoning. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered and signed the documents on the deck of the USS Missouri, one of the survivors of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This marked the end of World War II. For more information, check out these websites and discover how American ingenuity overcame Japanese persistence.